The squirrel was magic!
Say, do you like movies? Do you like music? Do you like video games? How about hanging out and having a good old nerdy time? Well, have I got the show for you. Take it away, boys! I'm Deadman.
I'm DJ.
And I'm the Mustard Colonel.
We're the hosts of VT Network.
A nerdy podcast about movies,
music,
video games,
and almost anything else we can get our hands on.
Come hang out with us every week
as we discuss all things nerdy.
Find us on every major platform you listen to podcasts on.
Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Progressive.com. Christian Meat. No, I'm just kidding.
That's
no,
VT Network. Search on any of them. Thank you very much for listening. And by the way, guys, that was a really good idea, hiring the vaudeville guy to do that intro.
I didn't hire him.
I didn't hire him either.
And no one hired me. I broke into Colonel Mustard's house to record this.
Beware your human heart. This is a Diabolical Index for Monday, September 9th, 2019, where the pages of the uncanny reside. I'm Corey Dawson at Moreland Manor. We had a few technical difficulties earlier, but they're all squared away. Andrew's back in the house. He had to carry the swift hammer of justice to its conclusion, and now he's back. But, yeah. Mushrooms on Yggdrasil. I came up with that for these two stories because it has everything to do with parallel worlds and worlds in collision and worlds that want to become our own and change our own into something they can use to their own benefit and twist with their evil tentacles and deeds, that type of thing. And I have to say, without a doubt, I was kind of trying to figure out which one to go with first because they're both just outlandish. Both of these books are outlandish. But first, before I go into that, I was hoping I would receive this before my next episode, and I did. I'm pretty pumped about it. Hey, book cam. What's that?
Oh. There you go.
All right.
You can stay on there too and talk about it.
The Conspiracy Against the Human Race by Thomas Ligotti. Ligotti has been compared a lot. I don't know if he would even enjoy that, but he started in the 80s, and I think that he was seen as I guess like a late contemporary of Lovecraft's. But I've had his books in the past, and when I originally read Ligotti, it was a long time ago, and I think I was so faithful to Lovecraft that I instantly just, I don't know, I wasn't a big fan of his work at the time, but I haven't picked it back up again. So when I found out about this, I ordered this and a couple of his bigger known, wider known works, Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grimscribe, his life and work. So I ended up getting those two to see if I couldn't, I don't know, I guess redeem my thoughts on this. But when I found out that he actually wrote a nonfiction book, it reminded me of supernatural horror and literature, the Lovecraft treatise on that subject. So I'm going to read the back of it for you real fast. Behind the scenes of life lurks something pernicious that makes a nightmare of our world. Thomas Ligotti's supernatural horror fiction is ranked among the most distinguished and disquieting in the genre. His first nonfiction book is no less estimable in exploring various domains to similarly disturbing effect. Drawing on philosophy, literature, neuroscience, and other fields of study, Ligotti takes the penetrating lens of his imagination and turns it on his audience, causing them to grapple with the brutal reality that they are living a meaningless nightmare. And anyone who believes otherwise has simply fallen under the spell of an optimistic fallacy. Now the new preface by the author, A Conspiracy Against the Human Race, may just convince readers they're more than a measure of truth in the dismaying yet unexpectedly liberating negativity that is a hallmark of Ligotti's work. I mean, maybe that's part of it. Maybe because there was, no hope that it just turned me off or whatever. But I am really looking forward to reading this one. But I think it's going to be dense, despite the few hundred pages, 243, 244. I think it might take me a while to get through this one. Speaking of getting through things, I have to say, these two are pretty small by comparison with most of the stuff that I get into, but it turned out that when I was going through these two, they really threw me for a loop in their, especially Agents of Dreamland. To say that it's non-linear is an understatement. It is all over the place. But it makes sense. It makes a good impact because it forces you to pay attention to things that normally you would have glossed over and maybe piece it together instead of just reading it from back to front. You have to kind of almost, because there's like a noir element to it. So in that respect, like there's a lot of unreliable information. There's a lot of half truths. There are a lot of things that go on off, I guess you'd say, like off camera and things like that. You kind of have to piece the story together for yourself, and I think that makes it all the more chilling when you have to mine your own imagination to get a lot of the facts from this thing. Let's see here. Oh yeah, no kidding. Emily brings up John dies at the end, which I will be talking about with the Black Books on Thursday night. So Yeah, believe you me, my brain is fried from all this stuff, and I love it. I love it with a passion. But yeah, so Agents of Dreamland by hope I'm not butchering this name, Caitlin Kiernan. I think I'm close anyway. If you read the back of this and the whatever you call it, the synopsis on the back, it gives you the gist of what you see on the surface of what's going on. But I think without a doubt, you bring that image up?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
It takes a while.
Yeah, there's a little delay, and I always forget. I get ready to go. I get anxious, sitting around waiting for this shit. But that book cover needs some Visine. Awesome. Yeah, I was thinking, damn, ashy. But yeah. So, Agents of Dreamland. It basically. It instantly reminded me with the language, with the way it was put together, kind of like the branching storyline, things, scenes upon scenes, time jumps. It reminded me of Gun with Occasional Music, right off the bat. Gun with Occasional Music was written by Jonathan Lethem. He's got a movie coming out, Motherless Brooklyn. I've been waiting for a long time, but Gun with Occasional Music is one of my favorite books. It's so absurd. It involves a private detective in the future, and animals have been altered in order to be able to live like men. And it's not this horrific dystopian Dr. Moreau type of thing. It's a really awesome hard-boiled detective story, except all the people that he deals with are like human size, or I guess kangaroos are already human size, but like anthropomorphized kangaroos are wearing like trench coats and stuff, and rabbits, and at one point I think they're called the Brain Trust or something like that, and they're like embryos that were going to be aborted, and then their brains are made giant, so they become insanely intelligent, superhumanly intelligent. But the way it kind of moved around, and by all accounts, like God Emperor of Dune was kind of the same way. These gigantic jumps in time. And with Agents of Dreamland, there's actually a character named Immaculata Sexton, and she's an agent. When they say Agents of Dreamland, it isn't like a euphemism. Like, it does involve two different agents from two different agencies that basically they deal with kind of like the darker vistas of human experience, and but it's not broadcasted really loudly. Because sometimes you read sort of like X-Files type spin-offs or pastiches and stuff, and they seem so I don't know, self-important when it comes to like making it this gigantic framework that you have to see to believe on the epic scale, and the scope of their reach is like everywhere. This doesn't really have to go that far, and in fact it doesn't. There's so many things that are left unsaid in the book, and you can't you can't gloss over anything. You can't leave any stone unturned. This was one where I had gone through a few pages, and I got to a point, and I realized that I didn't know what the fuck was going on. So I had to go back and look at it again, and it turned out that I had missed this one little vital piece of information. So as soon as I went back and kind of collected that, then it made the amount of sense that it could make. I don't want to come off and say that it's like a jumbled mess or anything like that. It isn't. In fact, I think it's perfectly balanced, except with a different sort of scales than you're used to. You kind of have to pay attention, which is good. I admired that, and I haven't read any of Kiernan's work previous to this, but after I was done I was looking around to kind of see what people had to say about it, and I think that we kind of gelled. We saw it the same way, and they said, basically, if you have a little bit of trouble, it's there. Like everything you need is there in the book, and what you need is also like in your imagination. If you were drawn to a book like this, then you'll be fine. You just have to, you can't give it short shrift. You have to give it your time, and it will be very, very cool. And in fact, it was kind of interesting the way it went along, because I was thinking as I was going along, I really hesitate to call things Lovecraftian if I can manage it, because most of the time when that term is used, it's completely off base for whatever reason. A tentacle comes out, all of a sudden it's Lovecraftian. If there's someone who happened to have a couple of attributes of a fish, all of a sudden it's Lovecraftian. But in this case, there were many points that started coming up as a reader. If someone actually has read Lovecraft in the past, there are a bunch of little nods subtly at first, and then they just lay a couple on you that makes you realize that this exists in a world where the characters that populate Lovecraft's work, their worst nightmares have been realized in this particular world. But Cannibal's she's in on it. She knows what's up. But okay, so anyways, the protagonist, if you can even assign a protagonist, there are actually 3 points of view that go on in the book. One is there's no assumptions of anything. So let's say a being called the Signal Man, and he's supposed to meet an agent from another I don't know what you'd even call these people. I guess like an organization. So his organization is known as Albany. And I don't know if that is a reference to like the area of New York that was mentioned in War of the Worlds broadcast, or what. Grover's Mill was the central one, but at one point they mentioned Albany in War of the Worlds. But he's a member of Albany, and he's there to meet Immaculata Sexton, who he basically, by measures, he says that if he could kill her, he would. And he wants to ask her all sorts of questions about her background, because she comes in the first, she basically runs him over the coals, like first thing off the bat. So he kind of like throws out all these questions that he would like to ask her, which to the audience makes her even like more and more mysterious as it goes along, because he's throwing out, what was your mother doing at the Berlin Wall when it went down, and what were those lights that were seen over your mother's house, all this stuff, and why can you walk through walls, and like all this craziness. None of them are answered, and none of them are even fielded by her. So she is a member of Y. So never explained. You basically see everything in motion. You don't. There's not a whole lot of explanation for what's happening. You just see it in action, and that's the only understanding that you have. And they're basically swapping information about Drew Standish, who is a cult leader in this shack on the edge of the Salton Sea, which I'm not really familiar with the Salton Sea, but I was under the impression that it was like a desert area in America. I don't know if it's... I was under the impression it was near California. But there's a shack there where Drew Standish has his kind of like Heaven's Gate cult following. And this is much more devious than any cult I've ever seen in a book, because it involves like the otherworldly seeding of the human race. And they're called the Children of the Next Level. And he has an acolyte named Chloe Stringfellow. And she welcomes this transcendence that he's offering, but at the same time she's kind of coughing from her lungs being lined with these spores that he's releasing to his members and stuff. And with the Lovecraftian angle, it was great. There was, with all the people who were trying for it, they brought some really, or Miss Kiernan. I'm assuming it's Miss Kiernan. It was so great because at one point you're seeing it from Chloe's point of view, because like I said, it's the Signalman's point of view, Chloe's point of view, and then Immaculata's point of view. And she kind of speaks about this. Everyone's collected like around this giant console television, like the big wooden crate televisions, and she talks about how it's like massively huge, and there's a mandala, I think she said, like this kind of like geometric framework on the floor that they all kind of huddle around. But there's one girl who has ceased to speak in words, which it was really super mysterious and unique the way they were. I'm just paraphrasing, but the way that they kind of talked about her, how she communicated without words, was really interesting, and how her skin had changed to these colors that couldn't be described and named, which takes you right back to the color out of space in Lovecraft's canon, where something comes down from the stars and everyone goes insane, and people are changed forever, and they go beyond what the human body and mind can comprehend and process. So they all revere her, saying that, you know, she's going to be the one who flowers, and like this whole idea of fruiting bodies. It's horrifying. It's just horrifying. So there's talk kind of in this meeting between Immaculata and the Signalman about this probe, New Horizons, which is starting to skirt Pluto. And there's one of the best things about this book is, if you pay attention and you kind of gather up all this information, you just start seeing horror references and noir references all over the place. And they speak of an American Yuggoth coalition that's doing some sort of protesting about the probe, because they start bringing back, you know, all this information from this flight, and they start seeing a cloud around Pluto. And Pluto in Lovecraft's work was known as Yuggoth. I don't know how to say it. Who does? So it flashes back and forth. You'll see that Immaculata, at one point, her kind of like her chapter heading comes up, and before it would say, you know, July. Most of the action takes place over about a week and a half, and it starts out like July 9th, and then it goes back to June 28th, and it kind of like counts down and then stops and then moves forward, and you get to Immaculata's point of view, and it says 1927, 1948, you know, 1975, and so on, basically, etc. Because she, Night Cannibal, she basically, they consider her a quantum foam traveler. So she's kind of on the same level, if you're familiar with Dr. Manhattan. She's kind of on that same level where she can experience all time. She can walk through all space. And it makes it really interesting from a detection point of view, because she can find something, or she can see the implications of something being found in the past and then find it in the future with the information that she's gathered from the past, that type of thing. But it's instantaneous. She doesn't have to really travel for that matter. And there were a few times where I was kind of getting confused as to whether or not there was active time travel happening, because the signalman actually speaks of like a raid, like a siege of Drew Standish's shack, and a fellow agent of Albany goes in with him, and I was unsure about whether or not it was a flashback or a flash forward. Confusing isn't necessarily bad all the time. To me, I don't like stones that are unturned. I don't like threads that are dropped and stuff like that. But I can live with things being slightly out of order, because then it becomes this unreliable timeline where you have to piece things together, kind of like Memento. If anyone's seen the movie Memento, I love that format with a passion. I thought that was masterfully done. And in this case, there's actually a siege on the compound, and when he gets inside, he's kind of dealing with another agent in tandem, and it's great. Yeah, it's horrible, because it just so happens that one time I bought a book on this. It was really super scientific. I couldn't understand a lot of it, but I learned a bit about a fungus that I think they actually call it the zombie fungus, which takes over ants, and it kind of attacks their brain and causes their motor function to do a specific thing on the bottom of a leaf, where it'll kind of put in like this death grip, and basically, determine what physical moves that it makes just through this spore of fungus in their brains. And then they end up using their bodies as kind of like a hotbed of this stuff. You seen it before? Yeah, so Andrew's familiar with it. So, but where it really got crazy is when they kind of bust down the door of this compound. He sees the same kind of behavior in a much larger fungus, and there's like spores like hanging in the air in the place. And instead of ants being kind of like clumped together and made into this breeding ground, kind of like this engine of spore production, it's this like clot of human bodies, and they're like frothing here and there, and it's kind of like bulbous and shit, and it's just horrible imagery, which is to say fascinating. But there are points where it seems like people are like remembering the future, and really odd time movements, and you start to realize that the world has completely changed. Whether or not it's someone's present, someone's past, someone's future, the only thing that makes it clear is that you see a Makalata in the middle of it. You don't see the signalman again at that point, but there are some things that definitely, I mean, I think that it, much like in the case of like Alan Moore with different parts of his works, Watchmen and V for Vendetta, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a lot of times there's a much larger story. There are clues to a much deeper theme, and maybe even subplot, that if you pay attention, if you take it apart, then you can find out that there were a lot of answers that were there all along. And one of the parts that it does that in is the signalman actually remembers back to his childhood, where he was watching a science fiction triple feature on television, and he talks about a movie called The Star Maiden, and it has to do with this beautiful woman being kind of entombed in this prison on Pluto, and it's like this shimmering citadel of like onyx and alabaster and all this jazz. And in the book, the signalman actually says that it's a lost, or people thought that it was lost, film by James Whale of Frankenstein fame, in this old dark house, the old dark house. and it's called The Star Maiden. And Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote it, and James Whale made it, and the leading actress said that she saw Men in Black on the set, and she ends up coming to some sticky end, and the lead actor he goes crazy due to some like homosexual panic, and he's being attacked and stalked and things, and then he ends up committing suicide, and basically the entire cast is cursed. The entire crew is cursed of this film, and it doesn't go much farther than that. He talks about seeing it as a child, and he doesn't get to, he's tempted as a kid when you're watching black and white films and stuff, you're tempted to fall asleep. So he's basically like speaking over time, and he says it took 26 years for him to figure out how this movie ended. And he sort of alludes to the interconnectivity of everything, where he's experienced this siege at Standish's place. He's experienced Immaculata, and he's experienced Chloe, who is the prisoner slash acolyte slash, kidnappy type of character. And I think that, like I said, it's going to take another read to completely immerse myself in this thing, even though it's not very long at all, but there's a lot to it. And I think that that story is supposed to mirror a lot of the things that he's experiencing in his own future, which might kind of give answers to a lot of the not necessarily unanswered, but unanswered in this, in the obvious, it's unanswered. And I was looking up this because I love James Whale, I love Edgar Rice Burroughs, and so I was looking all over for the place for this thing because there's a lot of information in the book that's real. But on the other hand, there's a lot that isn't. There's a lot of unreliable information where you have to kind of like put it through the code breaker of the entire book itself and figure out exactly what's going on, which I don't mind, but it is a particular taste. In fact, it reminded me of a lot of things. After I started getting in the meat of the thing, it reminded me a lot of, in the way the story is told, the language is used, kind of like the imagery and delivery, things like that. It reminded me a lot of William Burroughs and Robert Anton Wilson, the author of the Illuminatus trilogy. Philip K. Dick. There's a work by Atwood, Margaret Atwood, called The Blind Assassin, where it kind of employs that story within a story type of thing. And I love it when I can come across it, especially when you deal with a lot of different types of ledger domain and stuff, sleight of hand in a story where you're kind of manipulating the reader. I think that it's always a great time. Apparently House of Leaves is like that. I haven't tried it yet, but I'm going to. I promised that I would. There's also a little bit of Harlan Ellison, maybe some Palahniuk too. The entire crew of the Star Maiden film are gone. Suicide, Misadventure, Foul Play. But it's all done through this wonderful mix of character point of view. And then, as it goes along, it kind of brings you back to this present you're aware of. And another agent shows up and basically says that the Vance was the agent that the signalman had gone through the compound with. She's quarantined. The spores have taken her over. And she was deemed to be clean at the time. They had gone through decontamination and everything seemed like it was fine. So now he's under the impression that he's been in contact with many people since, and he could be causing the exponential growth of whatever the spore that Standish has brought to the masses is carrying. And then it goes back to, it gives you some information from the past, then it goes back to the present, then it'll go to the future to see kind of like the implications. And I don't want to say too much about that, but let's just say that I started with this one because it's the less hopeful of the two. It doesn't necessarily have this saving moment where the signal man, comes through in the end and puts everything to rights and all that kind of stuff. Not necessarily. There are futures involved that might not be what he expects. And, she can see it all because she could just, walk out of one room and into another universe. So, basically, this is a Lovecraftian's dream come true. Because it doesn't hit you over the head with it. It basically makes a story that's not necessarily embedded in the canon or the lore of any kind, but it has elements, definite ones, specific ones, and somehow they just mesh perfectly with what's going on here, especially when it comes down to the fact that most of the people who kind of like look beyond the curtain of eternity, they end up insane. Nothing makes sense. Nothing falls in line. There's no order. So when you're reading it and it's just all over the place, it makes perfect sense. And it almost makes you feel like, that's what it's like to transcend the human and maybe, become more of a denizen of Yuggoth. So I totally recommend it. I do concede that it's not going to be for everybody. It's not easy. It doesn't patronize you. It definitely takes it for granted that you're going to go the distance. Otherwise, it would just, to someone who didn't attempt to make heads or tails of it in their own way, it would definitely seem just like a bunch of craziness. I mean, it goes into the alchemical. There's scientific theory. Just for me, it was fun. It was a lot of fun going through it, and I can't remember. There was a book that I read. And it was one of the episodes, and I can't remember which author or book that it was. But I was basically saying, or actually, now that I remember, I think that it was a book. Yeah. It was a book that the Black Books Club was reading, and I tried on for size, and I kind of just torpedoed it because I couldn't stand that it was kind of telling me how to feel about what I was reading. Where it would go over this thing, and it would kind of come off and say, well, now this is the part where you're supposed to be really scared, or this would make anyone think twice about such and such. And I don't know, maybe that's the wrong way to look at it, but that kind of pissed me off. I think that when you're getting into a work and you're the audience and the reader, you can't assume how someone's going to take it. Everyone isn't going to like a certain work because everyone's different. And in this case, I think that it doesn't give you anything for free. You have to go through and totally comb this entire story for information, gratification. It's got some of the greatest chapter names ever. Chapter 2 is called Words Written Backwards. And the final chapter was Lowdown Subterranean End Times Blues Revisited. What an awesome chapter name. So, basically, the shorthand of it is, if you jump into this book, you're going to find some really interesting things. They may not make sense to you all together, all at once. But if you really go after it and take on the scavenger hunt of what it's trying to tell you, then you might end up with a really insanely just effervescent story of cosmic weirdness, and kind of like, I guess you'd say, the satisfaction of a not necessarily happy ending. So yeah, Ages of Dreamland, Caitlin R. Kiernan. Shit, I don't know. I'm probably butchering it. Who knows? But she's written a trilogy. I think his name, the Siwan. It's a Gaelic name. I think it's Siobhan. Trilogy of this one character, and one called, I think it's called The Drowning Girl and the Red Tree. So definitely check out her work. Apparently she went slightly more linear with some of her later stuff, and this is a return to form. So if you don't think you want to hang with some of the crazier stuff, definitely check her out in those other ways that might be a little bit more of a straight line, because she's a wonderful writer, nonetheless. Okay, so that's the mushrooms and Yggdrasil thing. It had to do with, the fungus from Yuggoth, and the thought of like a world tree of alternate parallel worlds, which was kind of touched on in that, but also comes into play in this wonderful book by Henry Kuttner called The Dark World. And what a blast. It was so much fun. Mostly because, I wasn't really aware of Henry Kuttner until I read Dance Macabre by Stephen King, where he basically gave you a list of all the stuff that kind of turned him on when it came to movies, comic books, magazines, books, basically pop culture of all kind. And one of the stories that he mentioned, and that I believe, and he may have also mentioned in his writing instructional, and he spoke about Graveyard Rats, is a story by Henry Kuttner, which for a minute it was really hard for me to find, and then all of a sudden I was able to find it easily. And he said it was one of the greatest horror stories of all time. So when you realize that Henry Kuttner not only wrote all genre of books, apparently he wrote his best stuff with his wife, C.L. Moore, and I've seen a lot of her stuff as well. So there was a little bit of apprehension about whether or not he could kind of hang on his own, because it's pretty much agreed that that's his best work, is when he worked with his wife. So this is a ton of fun, though. Basically, it completely reminded me of one of my favorite series, which is the John Carter of Mars series, because I love the John Carter of Mars series because of its just flat out high-flying adventure. There was romance, there was this royal lineage to deal with, and then it's an antiquated style, which I like fine. I like the antiquated style of the Burroughs novels of that time, Pellucidar and Carson of Venus and all that kind of stuff. It's just daring do, out of this world, especially when you think of like Tarzan, things like that. I totally recommend anyone to read Tarzan. It's surprising to read. There's a lot more to it than just like a man among apes. There's a lot more to it. He goes on all kinds of adventures, like interior Earth stuff, and it's awesome. But this reminded me a lot of that, because one of the major elements of John Carter is his transport to Mars. I think personally was one of the most creative, mind-blowing ways to have it happen. You think about Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, and they always use the craft to get where they need to go. And in John Carter, it's this astral projection, which I thought it had a convenience factor to it, but it was also imaginative as hell. Where for some reason he makes this weird when he does this ritual, his human body stays on Earth, and then there's like a copy. There's almost like a physical copy that's made on Mars, Barsoom, which I prefer Barsoom to Mars. I always call it Barsoom. So a copy is made on Barsoom, and then his mind and soul, I guess you'd say, is astral projected to that body on Barsoom. So his body on Earth is kind of encased in this cave or whatever. It's protected at first, and then later on he ends up going through measures to protect it himself. But this kind of had something similar, where The Dark World by Henry Kuttner, if I hadn't said it before. So he's a World War II veteran. So this is a slightly further in the future than John Carter. That's more like a Civil War era man. And this is World War II vet. He ends up crashing his plane in Sumatra, and I think they're called like the Bakats. They bring him back to health through some arcane means. They have some sort of like primitive science that seems like magic and all this stuff, and they bring him back. His name's Edward Bond, and once he kind of gets back home again, he starts realizing that something seems wrong. It seems like he's forgetting things, like things and places, you know, that he used to be in, and things he used to do. And when he holds a sword in his hand, it feels like it should be there, but it's not the right one. Like there's something missing, and he sees strange things that he's not sure if it's part of his memory or if he's being haunted or whatever. And he's actually in a cabin with his uncle. This gets into it quick. There's no filler. It gets into the adventure instantly. So he's sitting around with his uncle, and he sees a fire in the distance, and it kind of triggers this memory in him where he keeps thinking, you know, he's kind of bewildered because he keeps seeing things he recognizes, but he doesn't know why, what they are, what they mean, but he knows that he knows them. So he sees a fire out in the woods, and it strikes this chord with him, and it stays there. It doesn't go out. And his uncle's like, well, you know, people camp out there all the time. It's not that big of a deal. But he says, you know, this is different. The smoke is, there's an occult capacity to this smoke and stuff. And when the uncle goes to bed, Edward sees this vision of like this full-on like lycanthrope, like jumping through the window, and the window's like alive with moonlight and stuff, and there's this wolf man coming through, and he thinks it's a dream. But then later on, it seems like it's the next day, it totally happens again. The window becomes like this portal of light, and it's all, you know, it all comes from this fire that he ends up, you know, the name comes to him. It's called the Need Fire. And I guess you could say it's almost kind of like a Flugate, or like a, what was that boot that they grabbed in Harry Potter and sent him places? That term, I can't remember what it's called now.
Mary.
But
That they grab and they send them places in Harry Potter. She'll figure it out.
okay, yeah. So yeah. Anyway, trying to figure out what that term is, but basically this is like that, and kind of like in the second go round, the Wolfman comes through. But he's a lot more lupine this time. He's on all fours. And he's followed by this dwarf in a cowl. And it's like this ageless, sexless being that ends up, you know, saying that he's not who he, you know, thinks he is. And he's needed to come back to this Gaelic word that I have no idea. It's Carlier or something like that. And he needs to go back because there's a coven that needs him, that he leads this coven in this other place. And the dwarf starts talking about how there are worlds that are laid upon each other, and he's needed back where he came from and stuff. Her name is Edarin, and the wolf is named Lord Matholch. I guess I'm saying that right. I don't know.
A lot of syllables.
And there is it's just instant fantasy. The fantasy just explodes in this book because they're taking him from the place where he thought that he was from, but there's more to it, and it might explain his his deja vu and things that he thinks he remembers, and this kind of like longing for a place he's never seen and all that stuff. And they say they're going to take him to Medea, the Red Witch, and that there's a place called the Dark World, which is a parallel Earth that started. It was like fractured. The Earth was fractured by a decision that occurs in the past. So like everything was going along fine with kind of like both halves of this world, and then a decision was made and it cracks off where our world is above this world or below that world, beside it, parallel to it. And he's known as Ganelon in this world. And one of the coolest, I was really surprised by it when it happened. Because I was wondering as it went along, every once in a great while, Edward's mind would kind of almost become a spectator and see Ganelon's mind come out of him. Ganelon's behavior and his power and intimidation would start coming out of Edward, and occasionally you would wonder who was talking during a certain point in time, which made it completely awesome, because you didn't know if he was, if all of a sudden he made a decision after a certain point in time, kind of like the the character's voice would stop telling you who you should be thinking of when you're reading the dialogue or when you see the description of what's going on. You're not quite sure which one it is, which like instantly becomes kind of like this unreliable narrator, which I completely love. But in this case, I mean, it's even a little bit more sophisticated than that, because it's not so much an unreliable narrator as an unreliable identity. So you don't know exactly which side he's on, because on Earth it ended up being, like, physically it ended up being Ganelon, and Edward Bond's mind was put into that body. And in the Dark World, it was Edward Bond's body with Ganelon's mind encased in it. So then when they bring him through the portal to Medea, they switch places again. So every once in a while, the minds start to shift back. So it's great. Especially when you find out there's a rebellion against Ganelon's coven, who worship Lear, which it's a situation where you worship this powerful being. You don't want to meet this being that you worship, because you'll be rent in all the most horrific ways you can think of, and maybe even for eternity. Because even the wolf, the lycanthrope, he even says, we were enemies when you left. We could be friends now. So he makes you think that he might be interested in kind of like turning the coven, or turning his alliances towards the rebels. And, Edward talked to him and said, I don't know where I am. I don't know what all this means. And then the wolf will say something to him. And then all of a sudden, Ganelon becomes enraged, and you'll see him respond. And it's really, it's tricky. It's interesting, because the moment you think that he's going to make a decision that could, try to get him back to where he's supposed to be, then Ganelon takes over, and you weren't aware of it, and you see kind of like the changes that occur. But then at the same time, the more that Edward becomes familiar with where he is and what he needs to do to survive, it makes you even more unsure who's talking. And the Mathoch, he can become a man, a red-headed man. So he starts talking to Ganelin or Edward, take your pick, and kind of starts to lead him towards the light slightly, where he leads him towards this like grove of trees, and the trees start to attack him. It was totally great. Total fantasy. The trees start to, coil around him and attack him, and then there are words spoken by some of the rebels, and the trees let him go. And then it turns out that the rebels are like of the wood, and they call him Edward Bond and act as if they've been friends, these long months or years or however long it may be. They don't really talk about whether and where the kind of like the schism took place. So you're not sure if it happened previous to World War II or like during it or whatever, or maybe during the plane crash. It's hard to say. And Ertu is the, I guess, kind of like the man-at-arms of the rebellion. And he says, Edward, come back to us. Come back to the rebellion. You lead us to freedom. But then Ganelin starts speaking through his body again, and Ganelin is Ertu's, bitter enemy. So there's this constant thing between like trust and betrayal, and they never know who they're speaking to. So it's a constant conflict between these people. They don't know whether to trust him, whether to kill him or sacrifice him. And then when there's a girl, I don't think she's ever named. If she is, it's later and I missed it. But she even wants to strike the blow to Ganelin. So Edward kind of starts getting the idea that Ganelin wasn't too nice to this woman. And right before everything happens, Medea blasts out of the woods with this like scarlet cloak and stuff, and just pummels Ertu with this this mental blast and stuff. And it's interesting, they call her the Witch of the Colchis, and at some point in Agents of Dreamland, that same term came up, Colchis. So it was really weird. I mean, especially after reading a book like that where like everything's interconnected and it's layer upon layer and all this stuff. It was really weird to see all of a sudden these connections coming up, because I hadn't planned that. I knew that this kind of had to do with like parallel worlds and different worlds encroaching on other ones. So I thought I had that slight connection. But seeing that term in there was really weird. So when the Red Witch has him in her thrall again, and she's pissed off because basically he comes back to Edward again, and she's like, remember our love will span across time and power and evil and all this stuff. And he's kind of like, I don't recognize your face. I don't know you from Adam. And she's like, you don't remember me. It's that, the hell hath no fear like woman scorned. So then she says, we'll make our way towards Care Sicare, whatever. And they kind of left this out. I didn't catch it, but I guess that he was some sort of a historian or anthropologist at one time or whatever. After he got back from World War II, before he left, it's hard to say. Sometimes some of these pulp stories, things get lost in the shuffle occasionally. But basically, he had heard of Saint Sicare, or Sicare. It's like a Gaelic thing. And there were sacrifices done for the mass at this saint's mass. So he basically gets under the impression that this witch is actually leading him to be sacrificed to Lear. And it's this constant shifting of the balance where the rebellion comes up and kind of like saves him from the witch, and then he kind of thinks that the witch is his only way to power when Ganelin takes over. So then he goes with her, and then the rebels take him and try to convince him otherwise, and then she comes back. It's constant. So once he figures out he's going to be sacrificed, he tries to escape this, kind of like the coven that's kind of brought him back into the fold again, only to sacrifice him to the god. The rebels come back out again, like I said, constant shifting of the balance, and they bring him to their queen, Arliss, and she kisses him as if they had always, that he had always known. It's kind of like Total Recall, where he ends up in this place where everyone knows him, and some people distrust him, and some people ally themselves with him. So there comes like a little bit of a purposeful alliance between Ganelin and Edward in his mind, where Ganelin might accidentally end up doing the right thing just because he's pissed at the coven for wanting to sacrifice him, and kind of like the spurned affections of Medea, which Edward's completely ignorant to, but Ganelin starts to see what's happening. He starts to see that maybe his power wasn't quite so solid when he left. Maybe they were trying to take his spot at the table. So he ends up sort of working towards like Edward's benefit, just only because he wants to strike back at his own coven, because they wanted to try to take his power, and I guess kind of ruin his audience with Lear. So Artez's bodyguard, of course, Lauren, he doesn't trust him at all, and they end up doing something that may have been like the greatest mistake they ever made, which is there is this like grand mother of the forest people who lives in this cavern. It's like that old school, like there couldn't be a more like hero's journey thing where you end up having to go to this cave and go in to find your fortune or peril and stuff. And it's a fantastic adventure story. And I'm not gonna go too much further into what transpires in there, but basically when they bring him forth like to Freydis, the great forest mother, you're like all that time has passed where the story kind of tells you who's who. It kind of fades in the background, and he starts making decisions, and there's no longer this, like Ganelin has taken over, and Edward rails against the taking over of his body and soul by this dark wizard. It doesn't tell you anymore who's who. So what ends up happening throughout everything, you're not sure who's holding the reins, and ends up being a ton of fun. And I wanted to end on that one because Angels of Dreamland is wonderful, but it's not nearly as hopeful as this old school pulp adventure story. In fact, on the cover, it even has like this reprint from Tor, I think, or is it Peizo? I'm not sure, but you can see that Planet Stories, like the old school printing and the cool art. There's even like this enchanted sword, because when he ended up having a sword at the uncle's house that he kind of hefts, and oh my gosh, I almost forgot. The sword that he remembers, even when he's Edward Bond, he remembers back to this sword, and he tells his uncle, and his uncle thinks he's crazy. I showed you the book, and the image is still up there. It's funny. But he basically tells the uncle that he remembers a sword where, if he lifts it from the sheath even an inch, it can blow out like all the fires on Earth. And he said if he unsheaths it completely, then it beckons the end of the world. It's so powerful. So it's awesome because he brings the sword when he gets when they start bringing him through the portal. he brings the sword that basically means nothing from the uncle's, just kind of like his mantelpiece, and he brings it through, and it changes. It starts to glow and becomes something else once he comes through there, because Medea basically says there are two sides. Since everything cracked, there are two sides that are almost identical, just slightly different. And since he brings one sword over to the other side, it basically becomes that sword that he had thought of before. But it's awesome. You don't know if he's good or evil anymore. You don't know what his ulterior motives are. It's just really super awesome and interesting to see kind of this device being used in a story that was written. I mean, I would be surprised if it was written after the 50s. What will it say? 46. So it was originally written in 46. So to kind of see like a device like that used in this pulpy adventure novel, that would be interesting to see even in like a Steinbeck or anything like that, so that you don't necessarily know the motives of the protagonist that you're supposedly rooting for, and he may even meet himself on the other side. It's really wonderful. So there you go. I thought you guys would like those. Let's see here. Yeah, I think everybody's phones were dying, but it is late. It's after the witching hour and all that kind of stuff. But I'm glad that I got to go through these with you. I would definitely say give both these a try. The Dark World is definitely a palate cleanser from the Agents of Dreamland, because the Kiernan work, there's nothing I like better than some sort of creative work that gives me a headache trying to get everything sorted out. But that, like I said, is not for everybody. But then when you follow it up with this fantastic adventure story across time, across space, and then you don't really know what allegiance the protagonist that you are following from the beginning has, and whether or not he'll serve evil deeds under the guise of Edward Bond, this innocent World War II veteran. It was totally awesome. This cover is so interesting. That's not the way I saw these characters at all, but hey, that's cool. But anyway, yeah, I will get back to you about Conspiracy Against the Human Race, Thomas Ligotti. I will let you know when I receive the Songs of the Dead Dreamer and what I think of that, because I'm all about, trying things on later, because you can't say what you're going to like. If I don't like something at a certain point in time, it doesn't mean I'm not going to like it forever. And, just as easily as someone who likes something in high school, all of a sudden, they're in their middle age, you're not necessarily going to like it. But in my opinion, did they ever like it at all? I don't know. I still listen to a lot of the stuff I listened to in high school. But then again, I listen to everything. But, yeah. So I'm going to go through this insanely pessimistic philosophy and see what happens. I mean, I guess that I thought when I was looking it over, I thought it was going to be a treatise on horror in literature, but I guess this is like existential horror from every angle, according to what they say. Like, he's talking about like deterministic philosophy and all kinds of crazy shit. I can't wait. But yeah, nonfiction. That's a lot of times whenever I'm reading a nonfiction book, I read a fiction book at the exact same time to kind of keep that balance. And especially now since I have the show, I can't withstand that. And also, I'm gonna try to get into another reading of John Dies at the End before Thursday. So I'm going to be busy. So anyway, thanks for stopping out tonight. Beware your human heart, as always. From the Moreland Manor, finally, he made it. But hey, it's never too late. It's never too late. Especially since I think that we've been incredibly good about starting on time, or at least a lot closer to time than we had in the past lately. So yeah, Conspiracy Against the Human Race, Thomas Ligotti, Agents of Dreamland, Caitlin R. Kiernan, and The Dark World from Henry Kuttner. Definitely check out Kiernan's stuff, And Kuttner's Graveyard Rats, if you can find it, it should be on Internet Archive or somewhere online. It should be easy to find now. And they've collected his stuff and other things, especially with the CL Moore. So look around for that. I'm sure you'll find it. So I guess there's only one thing left to say. Read books or else.
Say, do you like movies? Do you like music? Do you like video games? How about hanging out and having a good old nerdy time? Well, have I got the show for you. Take it away, boys! I'm Deadman.
I'm DJ.
And I'm the Mustard Colonel.
We're the hosts of VT Network.
A nerdy podcast about movies.
Music.
Video games.
And almost anything else we could get our hands on.
Come hang out with us every week
as we discuss all things nerdy.
Find us on every major platform you listen to podcasts on.
Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Progressive.com. Christian Meet. No, I'm just kidding.
That's no, VT Network. Search on any of them. Thank you very much for listening. And by the way, guys, that was a really good idea, hiring the vaudeville guy to do that intro.
I didn't hire him.
I didn't hire him either.
And no one hired me. I broke into Colonel Mustard's house to record this.
Magic!